The freezing mud of the Ingush foothills was a patient, insidious predator. It did not attack. It simply consumed, pulling heat from a man's body with the slow, inexorable greed of the grave. For 72 hours, it had been Viktor Volkov's entire world. A relentless, parasitic cold that seeped through the triple-stitched Gore-Tex seams of his Leshy-patterned ghillie suit. It was a constant, chilling reminder of his own fragile mortality. A dampness that defied technology and discipline alike. It was a cold that crept beyond the skin, beyond the muscle, settling deep into the marrow of his bones. A dull, profound ache that his training could ignore, but never erase. That, and the view. Through the crystalline, fluoride-coated lens of his Zeiss Hensoldt Spotter 60, a piece of German optical engineering so precise he could count the wiry, salt and pepper hairs in the beard of the sentry posted 2 kilometers away. He watched the hunting lodge. The lodge, a sprawling dacha of dark, heavy timber and gray river stone, was an architectural boast against the raw, untamed wilderness of the Caucasus. It stood defiant in a clearing, smoke curling lazily from its massive chimneys, a symbol of power and permanence in a land defined by fleeting loyalties and brutal conflict. Officially, it was neutral ground, a place for peace talks brokered by international observers, a place for sworn enemies to break bread and pretend at civility. Victor knew it for what it truly was, a meticulously prepared stage. And on that stage, the final bloody act of a very long play was about to be written. He lay perfectly still on the frozen ridge, a wraith woven from mud, winter grass, and dyed jute. His breath plumed in the frigid, razor-thin air, each exhalation a tiny ghost dissipating into the vast, indifferent Caucasian sky. His body was a tightly coiled spring of disciplined stillness, a state of being that was less a learned skill and more a second nature. It was a state forged in the smoking, concrete skeletons of Grozny, where a single twitch meant a sniper's bullet, and honed on the sun-scorched plains of Dagestan, where the shimmering heat could betray a man's position from miles away. The cold now was nothing compared to the winter of '99. Huddled in a bombed-out apartment block, listening to the chatter of hungry rats and the distant crump of artillery, the memory of phantom ache in his joints. He was a scalpel for the Federal Security Service, the FSB. The kind they used for cancers deemed inoperable by conventional means. The kind that required an incision so precise the patient never even knew they'd been cut. His target was Aslan Basayev, known to his followers as the Wolf, and to the Kremlin as the Butcher of Budyonovsk. He was a man who had carved a path of blood and terror through 2 brutal wars, a phantom who had slipped through the nets of Spetsnaz kill teams, GRU assassins, and a litany of lesser men sent to collect his head. Basayev was more than a man of flesh and bone. He was an idea, a potent symbol of Chechen defiance, a legend whispered in mountain villages and cursed in the gilded halls of Moscow. And symbols, Viktor knew from bitter, personal experience, were infinitely harder to kill than men. You couldn't just put a 9x39mm subsonic round from his suppressed VSS Vintores rifle into a symbol. The Vintores, resting beside him, its integrated suppressor feeling like a natural extension of the cold steel barrel, was a tool of elegant finality. But it was the wrong tool for this job. A martyr's death would only strengthen Basayev's myth. To kill the symbol, you had to poison it at its root, let it decay from the inside out, discredit its very legend until it collapsed under the weight of its own myth. The rumble reached him first, not as a sound, but as a deep, subterranean vibration that traveled through the frozen earth, up through the carbon fiber tripod of his scope, and into the bones of his hands. He didn't need the optics to know. It was Basayev's convoy, not the sleek, anonymous black Mercedes sedans of the Moscow delegation that had arrived the day before, but a motley collection of battered Lada Nivas with sagging suspensions and a single, monstrously up-armored Kamaz truck. The truck lumbered like a prehistoric beast, its windows covered with welded steel plates, a heavy Dishke machine gun pintle-mounted on the roof, its black snout sniffing the air. All the vehicles were painted in a patchwork of mud-caked, faded camouflage, looking less like a diplomatic escort and more like a pack of scavenging animals. They moved with the cautious, predatory crawl of wolves entering an unfamiliar den. Victor's gloved thumb keyed the encrypted burst transmitter tucked into his collar. It was an R1685 UN Aqueduc, operating on a frequency-hopping spread spectrum between 30 and 108 megahertz. The signal would split itself into 1,000 pieces, dance across the bandwidth like a water spider, then reassemble itself at its destination, making it a ghost in the ether, invisible to any listening posts Basayev's men might have set up. A single, silent click, a packet of compressed data lasting less than 1/10 of a second. It was all the confirmation his handler in Moscow needed. The package is arriving. He swung the scope, the smooth, oil-damped hydraulics of the tripod, a whisper against the profound silence of the ridge. He found Basayev immediately. The man stepped from the passenger side of the lead Niva, not the armored truck, a classic, almost disdainful piece of misdirection. He was shorter than his legend suggested, but broader, a solid block of granite wrapped in a heavy winter parka. His beard was a thick, untamed mass, shot through with gray, and his eyes, even at this distance, seemed to sweep the surrounding tree line with an unnerving, predatory intelligence. Victor felt the weight of that gaze as if it were a physical touch, a cold finger tracing his outline. This was not some wild-eyed fanatic high on ideology. This was a grandmaster of a brutal game, a chess player who used human lives as his pieces. Surrounding him was his personal guard, the Volki, his wolves. They were hard men, veterans of 100 firefights, their faces etched with the grim resolve of those who have stared into the abyss and seen it blink first. They moved with a fluid, professional menace that spoke of years spent living on the edge of a knife. Their Kalashnikov AK-103s, fitted with Cobra red dot sights, held low and ready. Their trigger discipline was immaculate, their muzzles pointed at the dirt, their eyes constantly scanning the trees, the roofline, the sky. This was the iron ring Victor's plan had to pierce, not with force, but with guile. For 6 months, Victor's life had been a singular, obsessive study of Aslan Basayev. He had built a psychological profile so detailed, so intimate, he sometimes felt he could predict Basayev's thoughts before the man himself had them. He knew the man's preferred brand of cigarettes, Harbin, a harsh, unfiltered Chinese import he'd acquired a taste for during a stint in exile, the smell of which was said to be like burning tar. He knew Basayev favored strong green tea with precisely 3 spoons of sugar, a holdover from a childhood of scarcity. He knew of his preference for lamb over beef, his chronic, deep-seated distrust of anyone who didn't share his bloodline or his faith. Victor had studied high-resolution satellite imagery of his known compounds, read reams of intercepted communications, and listened to hundreds of hours of surveillance recordings. Basayev's voice a low growl on the other end of a long wire. Paranoia was the cornerstone of Basayev's survival. It was his shield and his most trusted advisor. He never ate food prepared by strangers if he could avoid it. He drank only from sealed bottles he himself opened. His guards, particularly his chief of security, Timur, a man with the face of a disgruntled bear, tasted everything first. A simple poison in his food would be an amateur's fantasy, an insult to the man's legacy of caution. The mission, codenamed Final Word, was anything but simple. It was a masterpiece of subtlety, a chilling confluence of advanced biochemistry, psychological warfare, and classic human intelligence. It hinged not on a bullet from a high-powered rifle or a bomb in a briefcase, but on a single, ornate ceramic plate. The plan had been conceived in the sterile, windowless laboratories of the FSB's Special Projects Directorate in Moscow, a place where morality was a theoretical concept and plausible deniability was a physical science. The poison was a marvel of malignance known only by its designation, Phoenix 7. It was not a conventional toxin. It was a complex, binary organophosphate engineered to be utterly undetectable in its inert state. The two primary components were microencapsulated in a silica shell no larger than a grain of pollen, and then molecularly bonded into the glaze of the plate itself. One component was designed to be released by the specific pH level of human stomach acid. The other, the catalyst, was released by the heat of cooked food, specifically a temperature range between 60 and 80 degrees Celsius. Separately, they were harmless, passing through the system without a trace. Once they combined in the target's digestive system, they would form a new, terrifyingly elegant compound. This compound didn't attack the nerves or shut down the organs in a violent, obvious way that would scream assassination. No, Phoenix 7 was more poetic. It was a potassium channel blocker. It would slowly, insidiously, disrupt the delicate electrical signals of the heart, inducing a massive, irreversible cardiac arrhythmia. To any coroner, even a skeptical Western one flown in for an independent review, it would look like a simple, tragic heart attack. A man of Basayev's age, an incredibly stressful lifestyle. Entirely plausible. No trace, no evidence, no martyrdom. Just an old wolf whose heart had finally, inevitably, given out. The problem, the monumental, near-impossible problem, was getting Aslan Basayev, the most paranoid man in the Caucasus, to eat a specific hot meal off a specific poisoned plate at a specific time. This was where Zaur came in. Zaur was the Dasha's head cook, a local Ingush man, a family man, with a wife and 2 young daughters in Nazran, and a son, his pride and joy, studying medicine at a prestigious university in Moscow. A son whose student visa was, coincidentally, up for review. A son who had recently, and very unfortunately, been photographed accepting a package from a known Wahhabist recruiter in a Moscow park. The photograph, of course, was a complete fabrication, a clever piece of digital theater orchestrated by Victor's team at the Lubyanka, blending 2 separate images with seamless artistry. But to a terrified father 2,000 kilometers away, it was as real as a death sentence. Victor had met Zaur only once, a week prior, a scene that now played in his mind with stark sensory clarity. The meeting was in the back of a stinking fish lorry on a deserted mountain pass under a sliver of a moon. The air was thick with the overwhelming, throat-catching stench of old fish and diesel fumes. Victor hadn't used his name, hadn't. He was just a calm, reasonable voice in the oppressive darkness, a shadow that laid out the stark, binary choice before the trembling cook. On one side, his son's immediate arrest, a televised show trial for terrorism, and a slow, anonymous death from pneumonia in a Siberian penal colony. On the other, a simple, single task. Ensure a particular plate, which would be provided, was used for Basayev's personal meal during the peace summit. That was all. Just one plate. He had watched the man's soul crumble in the dim, flickering light of a cheap battery-powered lantern. He saw the stages of its destruction, the indignant denial, the fearful pleading, the helpless, impotent rage, and finally, the hollow-eyed resignation of a man with no choice at all. Viktor had held up a tablet showing a live feed of Zaur's son sleeping in his dormitory room in Moscow. The crosshairs of a sniper scope superimposed over his chest. "We are everywhere, Zaur," Viktor had said, his voice a soft, almost sympathetic murmur that was far more terrifying than any shout. "There is no running from this. There is only cooperation. Think of your boy. Think of his future. A doctor. Such a noble profession. It would be a shame for it to end so prematurely." Zaur was their key. Their terrified, unwilling, utterly compromised key to the heart of the wolf. The plate itself had been delivered via dead drop 2 nights ago. Viktor had retrieved it from a hollowed-out log near a frozen stream, the package wrapped in oilcloth. It was beautiful. A piece of local artisan pottery with a hand-painted eagle design common to the region, its wings spread in defiant flight. It was indistinguishable from the rest of the Dasha's expensive dinner service, which Viktor's team had painstakingly researched and had a master forger in St. Petersburg replicate. He had spent an hour examining it in his miserable safe house, a one-room apartment above a bakery in a Nazran slum that smelled perpetually of yeast and despair. He wore nitrile gloves, his breath held, as if the poison could somehow leak through the air. It felt like holding a sleeping viper. The weight of it, the cold ceramic, was the weight of the entire operation. Now, that plate was in the Dasha's kitchen, swapped out for one of the authentic ones by Zaur the previous night. Viktor had watched the exchange via a micro-camera his team had planted in a smoke detector weeks earlier. The feed was displayed on a small, ruggedized tablet resting in the mud beside him. He had seen Zaur's trembling hands as he placed the poisoned plate at the bottom of a stack, his face pale and slick with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights of the kitchen. "Control, this is Kestrel. Eagle is in the nest. I repeat, the eagle is in the nest," Viktor whispered into his transmitter, his voice barely a rustle of leaves against the wind. The reply was instantaneous, a digitally compressed voice stripped of all emotion and humanity. It was General Morozov, his handler, a man who ran on ice water and state secrets. "Acknowledged, Kestrel. The clock is running. Phase 2 is authorized. Maintain observation. No further communication until confirmation." Phase 2 was the meal. The peace talks were scheduled to last for hours, a diplomatic dance of accusations and denials. There would be a midday meal served to the 2 delegations in the main dining hall. According to their intelligence, Basayev, ever the traditionalist, had requested a specific dish, zhigzhig galnash, a hearty Chechen stew of lamb and dumplings. A hot meal, the perfect catalyst for Phoenix 7. Viktor settled in for the long, cold wait. He scanned the perimeter again. Basayev's men were thorough. They had deployed their own portable communications jammer, a broad-spectrum R330ZH Zetel that filled the local airwaves with a hiss of white noise, rendering most conventional surveillance useless. But Viktor wasn't using conventional methods. His primary listening device was a laser microphone, an LDR-19 Prizrak. He had it trained on a specific pane of glass in a window of the main dining hall. The invisible infrared laser beam measured the microscopic vibrations on the glass caused by sound waves inside the room, translating them back into crystal clear audio. It was line of sight, impossible to jam, and utterly undetectable. The faint hum from its power pack was a quiet promise of omniscience. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The sun reached its weak, watery zenith, casting long skeletal shadows from the pines that clung to the mountainside. Through the Prizrak, he heard the drone of fruitless negotiations. The Russian negotiator, a slick diplomat named Valery Orlov, with a voice as smooth as polished marble, spoke in well-rehearsed platitudes about autonomy, reconstruction, and shared futures. Basayev's voice was a low growl, a gravelly counterpoint that cut through the diplomatic bullshit with sharp demands for full independence and war reparations. It was all a charade. Both sides knew it. Orlov was there to keep Basayev at the table, to create the illusion of progress. Basayev was there to project an image of a statesman, a legitimate leader, to the international community. Neither side expected a breakthrough. Only Viktor knew what the day's real, unwritten outcome was meant to be. At precisely 12:30, he heard Orlov suggest they break for lunch. Viktor's heart, a steady, disciplined muscle, gave a single, hard thump against his ribs. He shifted his focus to the kitchen camera feed on his tablet. The video was grainy, the connection occasionally stuttering, but he could see Zaur moving with a stiff, unnatural precision, a puppet pulled by invisible strings of fear. The other kitchen staff bustled around him, shouting and laughing, oblivious. Zaur was an island of silent, abject terror in a sea of culinary chaos. Viktor watched as the cook began to plate the stew. His hands shook so badly, he nearly dropped the heavy silver ladle into the steaming pot. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his back to the others, and reached for the stack of plates. Viktor held his own breath, the cold air burning his lungs. "Take the right one, Zaur. Take the bottom one. For your son." The cook's hand hovered over the stack. For a horrifying, heart-stopping second that stretched into an eon, Viktor thought he was going to lose his nerve and grab one from the top. The entire mission, 6 months of planning, the lives of Zaur's family, all balanced on the frayed nerve of this one terrified man. But then, his fingers slid down, his knuckles white, pulling the designated plate from the bottom of the pile. Viktor felt a surge of cold, professional relief wash through him, clearing his head. Zaur placed the plate on the stainless steel counter. He carefully arranged the chunks of tender lamb and the plump, glistening dumplings, his movements agonizingly slow. He wasn't just serving food. He was plating a bomb. A young waiter came to take the tray. Zaur said something to him, pointing emphatically at the specific plate. Viktor couldn't hear the words over the kitchen clatter, but the instruction was clear. "That one is for Basayev." It was part of the plan. Basayev's ego demanded he be served first, with the best portion. Zaur was merely fulfilling that expectation, a fact that would be remembered by the staff. The waiter, a local boy no older than 20, nodded and carried the tray out of the kitchen. The kitchen feed was now useless. Viktor switched his full attention back to the laser microphone, his ear pressed to the receiver. The audio from the dining hall was a murmur of low voices and the clinking of glasses against the distant crackle of a fire in the great stone hearth. He heard the clink of cutlery, the soft scraping of chairs on the wooden floor. "Ah, the smell of home." Basayev's voice rumbled, closer to the window now, richer and clearer. "It is good to eat honest food after so much of Moscow's poison." Viktor's knuckles were white where he gripped the cold metal of the tripod. The irony was a physical taste in his mouth, coppery and vile. He heard the plate being set down on the table. Then, silence. A long, drawn-out pause that stretched for an eternity, each second a lifetime. Viktor imagined the scene, the steaming stew, the ornate plate with its soaring eagle, the wary, intelligent eyes of the wolf assessing his meal. Then came the voice of Basayev's chief bodyguard, Timur, sharp and cautious, I will taste it first, my commander. Of course, the food taster. They had anticipated this. Phoenix 7 was designed for this very contingency. A single bite, even two, would not be enough to deliver a lethal dose. The poison needed time and volume to accumulate in the system. The taster might feel a slight nausea later, perhaps a headache, but he would live. Basayev, who would eat the entire meal, would not. No, Timur, Basayev said. The words were a thunderclap in Viktor's ear. Today, we are men of peace. We will show our guests we trust their hospitality. A bluff? A test of Orlov's nerve? Viktor's mind raced through a dozen possibilities. Basayev was a master of psychological games, of keeping his opponents off balance. But, Commander, Timur started to protest, his voice laced with urgency. Enough! Basayev snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Sit. There was another pause. The tension was a physical thing, a high-frequency hum in Viktor's receiver. He strained to hear the sound of a fork against ceramic. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the room and the crackling fire. What was he doing? Then Basayev spoke again, his voice laced with a dark, almost playful amusement that sent a spike of pure ice through Viktor's veins. Mr. Orlov, you have not tried our Chechen cuisine. It builds character. Let us trade. You will have my stew, and I will have your... What is that? Your little salad. Viktor's blood turned to ice water. His world tilted on its axis. No. It was impossible. It was a random, unpredictable whim. A 1 in a million deviation from the profile. All the planning, the technology, the human cost, all of it about to be undone by a simple, capricious act of theater. He could see it in his mind's eye. The plates being switched, the smiling diplomat Orlov lifting a forkful of poisoned lamb to his lips. The mission would be a catastrophic failure. They would not just fail to kill Basayev. They would murder a high-ranking Russian official on Chechen soil, creating an international incident that would set the entire Caucasus ablaze. Morozov's voice, cold and sharp as breaking glass, echoed in his head from their final briefing. Failure is not an option, Kestrel. There are no acceptable margins for error. His thumb moved to the abort button on his transmitter. A single press would trigger a series of untraceable events, culminating in a car bomb in Nazran meant to kill Tsar and his entire family, erasing the only link back to the FSB. It was the contingency plan. A bloody, brutal dead end. His finger hovered over the button, a god of life and death for a family he'd never properly met. An honor, Aslan. He heard Orlov's smooth, unruffled voice reply. But I must insist you have your traditional meal. It would be a grave insult to your culture and your generous hospitality if I were to take it from you. Good man, Orlov, Viktor thought, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The diplomat was sticking to his briefing. Keep Basayev comfortable. Placate him. Do not deviate from the script. Basayev laughed, a harsh, grating sound like stones grinding together. You see? Moscow's poison is not in the food, but in the etiquette. Very well. I will not offend my guest. Then Viktor heard it. The sound he had been waiting for. The most beautiful sound in the world. The distinct, sharp scrape of a metal fork on the surface of the poisoned plate. It was followed by another, and then the sound of chewing. Viktor didn't breathe. He was no longer a man, but an extension of the surveillance equipment. He was a pair of ears, a set of eyes, a nerve ending connected to a trigger he could not pull. He activated the biometric analysis software linked to the laser microphone. The software was experimental, designed to analyze the minute frequency shifts in a person's voice and the subsonic vibrations from their heartbeat, which also traveled through their body, the floor, and up to the window pane. It painted a crude but effective picture of the target's vital signs on his tablet. Basayev's heart rate, a steady 78 beats per minute. A green line, normal for a man his age at rest. He ate for several minutes. The conversation in the room became general, a mix of small talk and feigned bonhomie. Victor listened to it all, but his focus was on the soft, rhythmic sounds of Basayev eating his last meal. Every scrape of the fork was a tick of a clock counting down to 0. 5 minutes passed. Basayev's heart rate, 82 beats per minute. Still green, slightly elevated. Could be the hot food, the conversation. Could be anything, within normal parameters. 10 minutes. He heard Basayev push the plate away with a satisfied sigh. "Excellent," the Chechen leader declared, his voice booming. "My compliments to the cook. A true patriot." Victor's eyes flickered to the kitchen feed. Zaur was standing by a sink, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. 12 minutes. Basayev's heart rate, 95 beats per minute. The software flagged it with a yellow warning icon. The line on the tablet had turned amber, the calm green of life beginning to bleed away. "Are you quite all right, Aslan?" Orlov asked, his voice betraying a hint of concern. "You seem a bit flushed." "The room is warm," Basayev grunted. But his voice, even through the laser mic, had a new, strained quality. The resonant timbre was gone. "Open a window." Victor heard the squeak of a window latch. The audio quality improved instantly, becoming sharper, more immediate. 15 minutes. Basayev's heart rate was 110. The warning icon on Victor's tablet turned a stark blood red. He could hear the man's breathing now, a shallow, rapid panting. The Phoenix 7 was working its dark magic. The potassium channels in the cardiac muscle were beginning to fail. The heart's finely tuned electrical system was short-circuiting. I need some water," Basayev rasped, his voice suddenly weak, a pale imitation of its earlier growl. There was a commotion. Chairs scraped back violently. Voices rose in alarm. Timur, the bodyguard, was shouting in Chechen, his words sharp with panic. "Commander, what is it?" "My chest." Basayev gasped, the words catching in his throat. "It feels tight, like a hand." Victor watched the biometric display on his tablet. The steady, rhythmic line of the heartbeat was gone. In its place was a chaotic, jagged scribble, a seismograph of a dying heart. Ventricular fibrillation. The heart was no longer pumping. It was just quivering, a useless bag of muscle. It was the clinical signature of death. "He's having a heart attack," Orlov shouted, his diplomatic cool shattering completely. "Someone call a doctor." It was too late for a doctor. It was too late for anyone. Through the microphone, Victor heard a heavy, sickening thud as Basayev's 200-pound body hit the polished floor. He heard the screams, the panicked shouts of the guards, the frantic, useless commands of the Russian delegation. He listened to the chaos for another 30 seconds, a detached observer at the end of the world. Then, he calmly keyed his transmitter. A single click. The package is delivered. He began to break down his equipment with swift, economical movements learned over 2 decades. The Ventores in scope went into a custom-fitted polymer case. The tripod collapsed with a soft click. The laser microphone was dismantled into 3 pieces. Each component was wiped clean of prints and packed away. He was a ghost erasing his own footprints. Within 10 minutes, his observation post was sterile. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there. He slung the pack over his shoulder, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. He moved back from the ridge, melting into the deep woods, his ghillie suit making him one with the shadows and the dead leaves. He had a 12-kilometer hike to his exfiltration point, a remote shepherd's hut where a K-60 Kasatka transport helicopter would be waiting. As he walked, the sounds of the dacha faded behind him. The shouts, the sirens he could now hear approaching in the distant valley. It was no longer his concern. His part of the war was over. He moved through the silent forest, his only companion the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the frozen ground. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not remorse, not satisfaction. Just the quiet, hollow emptiness of a job well done. The wolf was dead. The butcher had paid his bill. 2 days later, Victor was sitting in a sterile debriefing room in the FSB's sprawling Yasenevo headquarters in Moscow. The air smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaning solution, and the faint ozone hum of servers processing the nation's secrets. Across a polished mahogany table sat General Morozov. He was a man who seemed carved from gray granite, his face an impassive mask, his eyes like chips of glacial ice. The official cause of death has been confirmed by the Joint Commission, Morozov said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. He pushed a thin file across the table. Acute myocardial infarction. The international observers have accepted the findings. Basayev's inner circle is in disarray, already fighting amongst themselves for succession. It is, by any measure, a perfect operation. The president sends his personal commendation. Victor nodded, saying nothing. He opened the file. It was a preliminary autopsy report, translated from German. He scanned the technical jargon. Severe coronary artery disease. Evidence of previous ischemic events. Ventricular fibrillation. Everything was as it should be. The legend of Phoenix 7 remained intact, a ghost in the machine. You have earned a long leave, Victor, Morozov continued. Go to the Black Sea. Take your family. Forget this business for a while. And the asset? Victor asked, his voice quiet, the first words he had spoken. The cook, Zauer. Morozov steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering, impenetrable. The asset has been resettled. His son's legal difficulties have been resolved. He and his family have been given a new life, a new identity, in a different part of the Federation. They are quite safe. Victor looked at the general. He had known Morozov for 15 years. He knew the man was a master of the unspoken word, of the carefully constructed lie that was truer than the truth. Victor had seen the contingency plans. He knew what resettled meant in the lexicon of the Special Projects Directorate. It was the same word they used for decommissioned weapons and compromised safe houses. It meant erased. That's good to hear, sir, Victor said, closing the file. There is one final detail, Morozov said, a flicker of something almost like intellectual pride in his cold eyes. A piece of intelligence you might find interesting. We retrieved the plate, of course. Our forensics team went over it. They confirmed the poison was delivered as designed, but they found something else. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. A small, cruel piece of theater. 6 months ago, our medical intelligence unit acquired Basayev's complete health records through a source in a Turkish clinic he visited for a checkup. He had a severe congenital heart defect, a ticking time bomb. 3 different cardiologists gave him less than a year to live, with or without a war. His heart was going to fail, Victor. Sooner or later, it was inevitable. Victor stared at the general, the implications washing over him in a cold wave, colder than the Ingush mud. The multi-million ruble operation, the advanced biochemical agent, the coercion of a terrified man, the risk of a catastrophic international incident. It was all just insurance. They hadn't just killed a man who was already dying. They had orchestrated his death to happen on their terms, on their stage, to write the ending to their own satisfaction. We did not leave the security of the Russian state to chance, or to the whims of a faulty Chechen heart. Morozov said, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips for the first time. We simply ensured the final word was ours. Victor stood up. The emptiness he had felt in the forest had returned, but now it was heavier, colder, a block of ice in his gut. He had been a scalpel, yes, but he saw now that the patient was already dead on the table. His operation had been nothing more than a piece of political theater, a gruesome post-mortem performed on a living man for an audience of rivals and allies. He walked out of the debriefing room, the general's words echoing in his mind. He thought of Basayev, the wolf, a dying animal lured into a final, elaborate trap not to kill him, but to control the narrative of his death. And he thought of Zaur, the cook, the simple man, a man whose life and the lives of his family had been utterly destroyed, their souls poisoned far more effectively than Basayev's body, all to guarantee a foregone conclusion. They were a loose end that had been, in Morozov's sterile language, resettled. Victor walked through the long gray corridors of the Lubyanka, the concrete and steel heart of the machine he served. The polished floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, making the hallway stretch into an infinite, sterile tunnel. He passed portraits of past directors, their cold eyes following him from behind glass. He passed other men like himself, their faces impassive, their shoulders carrying the weight of secrets he could only guess at. He had always told himself he was a soldier in a necessary war for his country's survival. But in the chilling silence of that hallway, surrounded by the ghosts of a million compromises, he understood the truth. He was not a soldier. He was a stagehand. And the play was a grotesque tragedy written by monsters. The wolf was dead, and a shepherd had been sacrificed to prove it. The silence that followed was not peace. It was just the space between screams.